You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Malfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome everyone to PolyPat. PolyPat is back, and we are taking a little break from our Bible series today, and we're going to talk about arguments for God, supernatural versus naturalism, and interwoven in all of this, Pat's been working on a really cool journal article about God being the prime thinker, which will interweave throughout this. So anyway, this is going to be a fascinating episode. Pat, I would love to hear your initial thoughts to just introduce this episode as we talk about God's existence and the different philosophies that are at play here when we're talking about this.
Right, yeah, well, as you know, this is sort of the thing that I spend probably the most time thinking about. I actually have 2 articles under review right now. Both are arguments for God from different directions. One is a sort of just metaphysical argument from the nature of dependency. The idea is if we can admit that there's just one dependent thing, right? We can put the logical machinery in place to get us to the fact that there also has to be a purely actual an independent thing to explain all that. Then we kind of run a conceptual analysis on that, and we'll see that that's essentially the God of classical theism. So that article is concerned with an issue in the kind of contemporary philosophy of religion literature, which is called the gap problem. Like, how do you get from saying that there's a necessary being to that necessary being God? So that's one thing I've been thinking a lot about and have written about. We could maybe talk about that later. Another concerns, and I know we've talked about this before, the principle of sufficient reason and its relation to the problem of evil, where I kind of pose something of a dilemma to skeptics of a certain sort. And skeptics of a certain sort, I mean skeptics who want to say that the problem of evil is an issue for theism because theism can't explain the problem of evil, but then who often make the immediate turn and try to escape cosmological arguments for the existence of God by admitting what's called brute facts, saying that essentially not everything needs an explanation. So essentially that paper is all about, look, you're being inconsistent here, right? You're saying that we need to have explanations all the way through over here, and that's why the problem of evil is an issue for theism. However, when we commit to needing explanations, it seems like we can't avoid theism, so then you say, well, we don't need explanations after all. So I'm like, you got to pick one here, buddy, right? Yeah. That's what that one's about. Obviously, in much more detail than I just explained. And then finally, recently, I've been working on an article that started from a thought that I got from philosopher John Haldane. He's got a wonderful dialogue book with an atheist, and in that dialogue book, he kind of gives a general sketch of what he calls a prime thinker argument. And towards the end, he says, yeah, this is kind of just a sketch. I didn't mean this to be, absolutely ironclad or anything like that, but I hope there's enough here that somebody will take it and develop it. And I thought it was really interesting. So I kind of went and looked around and tried to see, well, did anybody develop this? And I haven't really been able to find anything. So I've been spending a considerable amount of time trying to develop this line of thought from John Haldane. And the short of it is this. I'll get the sketch on the table, and then we can just take the conversation wherever you want, is that we have this sort of conceptual activity, right, that isn't inherent to us, right? We come to possess concepts only under appropriate conditions, right? So we have this potential to possess concepts, right? But we need to actualize, like the concept of a cat, for example. We don't come into the world with a conceptual understanding of what a cat is, right? We have the potential to understand a cat when people point at different animals and say, that's a cat, that's a cat, that's a cat, right? Eventually we come to possess the concept of catness, whatever that is, right? So it's not something that's inherent to us, right? Not by our own being. We don't have innate ideas, more or less, right? Okay, so there's this sort of causal actuality, this conceptual power that we have that is not inherent to us, right? So it points to a sort of extrinsic factor needed to explain this. And then there's also a move that whatever else goes into conceptual thinking, it can't be a material physical thing. That's another move that has to be made. We can talk about that later. Okay, so whatever the ultimate cause of this sort of causal actuality in us, it can't be explained in terms of any entirely physical story, right? Like, and that would include evolution or anything like that, right? So it's not inherent to us. We need something beyond us to explain it. A physical explanation isn't going to work. What are we left with, right? That's kind of the idea here. And then what Haldane does, and what I try to expand upon, is that whatever else we're going to have to trace back to, it's going to have to be something that does have this conceptual actuality in virtue of what it is, not in virtue of something else, right? That's just sort of inherently conceptual. In short, that whatever brings about thinking things itself has to inherently be a thinker. That's the short of the argument. And it has to be a thinker in a purely actual sense in the traditional notion of God. So it's just going to be purely and fully conceptual, an unrestricted act of understanding itself, in other words. And that's kind of I think this is kind of the reason I want to pursue this line of thought is I think it actually does a lot of cool things at once, Eric. I think it shows that human beings have an immaterial power, right? There's something about us that is not reducible to the purely physical realm. And this is intellectual activity, broadly considered. It might have strong physical correlates and stuff like that. It might depend upon physical systems, right? But it's not reducible to them, right? That's one thing. So now we have an argument against physicalism just outright from conceptual formation, right? And then it sets up a causal regress in which we have to get back to a source of this power that is itself in the order of that power, right? It has to itself be a thinker in some way, and then so you kind of get to God, but you get to God as a thinker, as conceptual activity, which kind of leads into omniscience as well. So that's what I've been working on. We can take this conversation in any direction we want, but yeah,
man. So okay, so the human being, let's say, over time, like we gather the data from our senses, right? We can touch and see and feel a tree. And over time, like by doing that over and over again with different trees, we know what treeness is. Right. We have a concept of a tree. So even if we're not looking at a tree, we can close our eyes and we can envision a tree. That envisioning, that abstraction, we could say, is an immaterial realm. Right. But that was dependent upon the physical realm for human beings. So are you saying that like there's no way, like the concept itself had to precede human existence because we can't just, or would someone on the physicalism side, well, like, yes, you made that concept, but you only did it over time after interacting with physical things. Right. So it actually evolved in your mind. Yeah. And so it wasn't there beforehand. What do you...
Yeah, the answer is yes and no. It does precede us in a sense that God precedes us, right? But we do depend on coming into contact with the material physical world, right? We don't... So in this paper, I argue against the thesis of innate ideas, right? That we just have these concepts in us inherently. One is it just seems totally
like Plato,
false.
I guess.
I'm thinking more along the lines of later, more modern thinkers who posited this. But it just seems false, or at least extremely weird. One is that like it seems like I come to possess ideas, not that I just have them, right? This is just a basic fact of experience, right? I don't remember having the concept of triangularity, when I was born or something like that, right? Or even, for a while after that. So that's the thing. But also, if we have innate ideas, then there's also just kind of like weird things about it. Like, how many do we have? Do we have 10,000? Do we have 100,001? And how did they get there? And it seems like if you're going to go the way of innate ideas, you're probably going to have to go the way of theism anyways, and just say that God just put so many in us, right? And that's it. So if you're trying to avoid my conclusion by picking up innate ideas, which almost I think naturalists would want to do anyways, I think the only way you would try and be able to support that is by going to a directly sort of theological conclusion anyway. So that's the first thing I want to say. That it's just obviously false upon experience, right? That all knowledge first depends upon our interaction with the world. It comes through the senses, right? However, that we have this sort of inherent potential. We have an essence, right? That under appropriate conditions, we have the potential to possess the concept catness, but we need that potential actualized by, looking at different cats and essentially having someone else make those conceptual discriminations for us. That's a cat, that's a dog, and we do this with our children all the time. And it's very funny to watch it happen with children, because you can tell children have a concept before they can associate the right term with it, right? So I'll give you a quick example, Eric. My daughter, Marin, she calls a lot of people mama, right? Like she calls our oldest daughter Mira mama. She calls her actual mom mama, and she calls my wife's friend Katie mama. And me and Christine were thinking about this, like, okay, what concept is she associating with that term? Because it isn't the right concept, right? We know that you only have one mama, Marin, right? And the best we could come up with is she has the concept of caretaker. And she's associating the concept of caretaker because she's come to possess that concept under appropriate conditions, right? Of pointing and certain things happening when these situations occur, of people who regularly take care of her, give her snacks and juice and hugs, right? And she thinks that the term that goes with that concept is mama. So now we have to actually correct that and say, no, the term that goes with that concept is presumably caretaker. We might be wrong.
Take a while to
say. Right, but we'll figure it out over time, right? But
Yeah.
the thing is, she has come to possess a concept, and now it's the matter of getting the right term to that concept, right? We see what we're saying there? Now,
Yes.
in terms of can this be entirely physical, the answer is no. And there's two reasons for this. One is concepts have two properties which no physical thing could ever have. They have a property of universality, and they have a property of determinacy. Now, the property of universality is the one that Aquinas uses. He says, here's the thing. We understand triangularity, right? But where in the physical world is triangularity? It's nowhere, right? At least not perfect triangularity, right? Because everything in the physical world is always to some degree imperfect, and it's always a particular triangle. It's this triangle, it's that triangle, but it's never triangularity as such, right? So, and this is really key. This is really I think critical for Aquinas' general point, is our concept of triangularity, right? It's not something like we can image, right? It's not something we can imagine. And this is a difference between perceptual ideas and conceptual ideas. If we try to picture or image any particular triangle, it will always be bounded, right? It will always have a particular shape. It'll be isosceles or a scalene triangle. It might even have a particular color. But we don't picture think triangularity. It's something that we conceptually understand, that we know the essence of. And it's that conceptual understanding of, or the universality of triangularity, that applies to all and any particular triangles, right? So anything particular is not universal, right? But all physical things are particular. However, our conceptual understanding of triangularity is universal. And so there you go. Whatever else is the case of conceptual thinking, it's not something that's reducible to the material physical world, because everything material and physical is not just particular, it's also imperfect, right? Like we never actually find perfect triangularity in the world. There's always minor perfections, right? The angles aren't quite exactly as they need to be. The lines aren't quite exactly as straight as they need to be, even if we use our most precise tools to draw triangles. It's never perfect triangularity, right? Everything particular material always is imperfect to some degree. Yet we understand triangularity perfectly, right? We understand what it means for something to and not just triangularity, but circularity. Geometry is easy for this, right? Because we think we can get the essences of geometrical figures more easily than we can get the essences of a lot of other things. So we kind of use them as stock examples. But there's also the issue of determinacy. And determinacy means that when I have conceptual content, when I engage in at least formal thinking, I know exactly what I'm talking about, right? There's a determinate conceptual content there, and it's not ambiguous, right? However, any physical thing is always ambiguous. If I draw a triangle on the board, right, there's nothing about the physical properties alone that tells me exactly what that means. Does it mean triangularity? Does it mean small triangle? Does it mean big triangle? Does it mean the obscure forgotten pop band triangle, right? So there's nothing, you see what I'm saying, right? There's nothing about just the physical properties that can fix what's called determinacy of meaning, right? But we know we have determinacy of meaning because we use it to communicate all the time, and we can't even deny it. So to say that, like, we don't know what we're talking about when we talk about triangularity, or that we reason by modus ponens or modus tollens, to say we don't know exactly what we're talking about presumes that we do know exactly what we're talking about in order to deny it, right? So we can't get away from what's this issue of determinacy. Like, we really do have an unambiguous, exact conceptual content of what we're talking about. Certainly in formal thinking, but I would argue in all thinking. And that itself is not reducible to any physical explanation or physical story, because within the order of the space of causes or physical causes, there's just really an infinite number of ways that we could conceptualize over above it, right? I can think of Eric and all the physical facts about you. I can think of you as a podcaster. I can think of you as a podcaster who's about to get married. I can think of you as a podcaster in a tank top who's about to get married, right? I can think of you as somebody who holds a master's in theology. You see, like, the space of reasons always floats over and above the space of causes, right? So one is really not reducible to the other at all. So between universality and determinacy, what we're saying is that thinking has, that there's a property that cannot be physical or material, right? And thinking has this property, universality and determinacy. I would say it has both of those properties, and neither of those properties can be purely physical or material. And it's from that we argue, okay, whatever else this is going to be an immaterial power, right? It's going to be a formal sign, as the scholastics used to call it, right? So now, okay, we have this power. It's not reducible to the physical. We don't have it in virtue of we are what we are. So now we have a causal regress, right? Now we got to get back to something that can give us this power without having to derive it from something else. And that means we're going to have to get to something that is itself inherently conceptual. And since we've argued this could be no physical thing, it's going to have to be an immaterial thing. And it's going to have to be, it's going to have to also be, it's not going to not just have to have the power to produce thinkers. Itself will have to be a thinker. Because in inducing concepts in others, that is itself intentional activity, right? And the reason that's important is sometimes you have these general causal principles, right? That whatever is in the effect must in some way be in its total cause, right? That's a pretty general, I think, safe causal principle. But that doesn't mean that the cause has to be like of the form of the effect, right? So I create a chair, right? But I'm not a chair, right? But the chair does resemble me in as much as I have conceptual activity. I can intentionally arrange different parts to suit a particular end, right? So the chair resembles me in as much as I am a thinker who has the power of conceptual activity to purposefully arrange parts to a particular end and something like that. So even though I am not F, if F is a chair, I still have an F-ness producing power, if that makes sense, right? So whatever is in the effect is in some way in the total cause, right? I contain the power to produce whatever effects I do, either formally, virtually, or eminently, to use some traditional terminology. However, when it comes to producing thinkers, I want to say, no, whatever ultimately produces thinkers itself actually has to be a thinker, because in producing thinkers or producing anything in the world, it's all that is expressive of something that is engaged in intentional activity of arranging things towards a particular end, which ties in well to Aquinas's fifth way. So, yeah, I just dumped a lot on the table there, Eric. So why don't I let you start wading through some of it?
Wow, no, that's amazing. I think it's so ironic how, oftentimes people that are atheists, let's say, and argue against God's existence or have a purely physicalism mindset, it's like the very thought process that got them to think that God did not exist in and of itself is an immaterial reality. And so that's the large irony. If you were to say, like, I only believe in physical things or natural science, what science can prove, like what's here and now, and there's no invisible realm, like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, actually, just your thought process there, like, can you test that under a microscope? Can you, like, did that evolve somehow through physical things over time? Like, or no, like the way you're even thinking and all these concepts, those are immaterial realities. So you have to at least admit that there is an invisible or immaterial dimension to our own existence.
Right.
And once you admit that,
or and it's interesting to note that there are a number of atheists, physicalists, materialists who agree with at least a lot of what I've just said, at least the substantial points. But so what they'll say is certain thinkers who are materialists and physicalists will say, yeah, actually it's true. Right? If everything at the end of the day is a story that a physicalist can give, then we can't account for the determinacy of meaning. And so what they do is they say there is no determinacy of meaning. There is no facts of the matter, right? So they just bite the bullet and go the other way. But that, to me, is actually a great compliment to the theist and the argument that I'm making, right? In the sense that, okay, we agree on this. You see it as I see it. But now here's the issue. Your position is absurd, right? So just run the modus tollens, right? And become and realize that if you can't account for this thing that cannot be coherently denied, which is that we engage in formal thinking that has a determinate, exact, and unambiguous thought content, right? If you're led to deny that, that position is self-defeating. It's radically absurd, right? So whatever is causing you to deny that is the thing you should itself abandon rather than embracing the absurd position. Mm-hmm.
So for them, instead of seeing a triangle and knowing that, like, we have some sort of meaning to that triangle, whether it's that pop band or an obtuse triangle or a pool table thing, whatever that's called, instead of saying that there has to be a certain meaning that we associate with it or that we put a meaning into it. So how do they resolve that? They just say, well, it doesn't mean anything. You can just make up the meaning or.
Right. Like, some will say that, well, we can approximate what it is, right? And there's a huge issue with that, right? The huge issue is like, well, what do you know that you're approximating, right? Because to say that you're approximating something means you have an understanding of what you're approximating, which means that you're assuming the thing you're trying to deny, right? Well, we just approximate reasoning via modus ponens. Well, to even say that you're approximating, it means you understand the thing that you're trying to deny. But you've just denied that we can't understand this thing. You see what I'm saying?
Because there's something to which they are closer and closer drawing towards.
Yeah, so they would say, well, yeah, you're right. There's no fact of the matter. We don't really reason via modus ponens, but it seems like we can really approximate it. Well,
what do you mean by modus ponens?
Yeah, it's just a sort of logical inference, right? Like if P then Q, affirm P, therefore Q, right? Basic. Or you could just take addition, right? So something people are more familiar with, right? It seems like we really understand what we're doing when we say that we're adding, for example. Well, somebody say, well, maybe we aren't really adding. We're just approximating to this idea of adding. But again, like, to even make sense of that, you have to have a clear conceptual understanding of what addition even is.
And so the radical physicalists would be like, no, we don't know that we're adding.
Right. They'll accept the now the problem with that is if you deny that we can do any of these things and you deny that we really do reason. The reason I bring up like modus ponens or modus tollens is because if you deny that we are actually engaged in these determinate conceptual formal thinking processes, right? If you deny that that's ever the case, then all your arguments are invalid, right? Because you can't have a valid argument unless you have, of course, valid logic. And you can't have valid logic unless we have determinate exact conceptual concept of formal thinking, right? So like it's always going to be a self-defeat issue here for the person who wants to try and bite the bullet on that. And again, to even to say that we don't engage in formal thinking, right? Addition, modus ponens, whatever. To say we aren't doing that assumes you know what that is. So you see, like there's a vicious self-defeat problem here. So that's what I'm saying is like the alternative, it almost immediately always reduces to the absurd. So we can't even escape it. Like clearly we have this power. Clearly we engage in formal thinking. Clearly we can grasp conceptually universals. And clearly there's determinate, unambiguous, exact conceptual content here. We can't deny that. Now, if physicalism leads us to deny that, physicalism must be false. And then that helps to, advance the prime thinker argument.
Yes.
Right?
Now, what about the thinker that's like, no, I admit that there is this immaterial, invisible dimension, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a prime thinker or God. How would you articulate to them that leap? You already described it, but just going from that reality to like, well, there has to be this first cause then,
right,
of all of this.
Yeah. So, I mean, one is just if you're committed to the causal principle that I put out before, right? How do we come to possess these concepts? Well, we don't have them essentially, right, in virtue of what we are. So that means that's going to include all the human community, all the language using community, right? We just don't have that. So we can't explain it just within that system itself. We have to get beyond that system, and we can't explain it by any physical story beyond that system, right? That was the whole point of everything that we've just said, right? So something has to introduce this. Now, how it introduces it, I leave that completely open. But I'm saying, in principle, it can't be something that is brought about within that collection itself, or any physical story that surrounds that collection, right? So you could say it's just a brute fact, but I think that's problematic for a bunch of other reasons. Or you could say, well, maybe there's this, and I think this is what you're hinting at, Eric. Maybe there's this sort of like Platonic heaven. We're gonna go Plato with this, right? It's not God, it's Plato. It's Plato's realm of the forms. Well, now you have a causal problem, right? Because say that you think, okay, there's this immaterial realm of forms, right? And that's where it all is, right? And it's totally abstract. Well, the issue with positing that is whatever else people want to say about abstract entities. They typically almost always want to say that what makes an entity abstract is that it lacks any causal efficacy, right? It's causally effete, right? That's sort of what differentiates abstract entities from concrete entities. Concrete entities can really affect things. Abstract entities can't. In fact, I would say abstractions are just works of concrete minds to begin with, right? So it's just getting things backwards here. So now we have a causal connection problem, right? And not just a causal connection problem of how this world of the forms at all would induce concepts in us, but how it lines up in any sort of way. It just seems like an extravagant explanatory mess with that doesn't have the explanatory or causal resources to make sense of the things we need to make sense of. Whereas with God, we do, because God presumably and traditionally is a concrete existing reality that is inherently conceptual, right? So God, in virtue of being a concrete thinker, then in a purely and fully actual sense, can intentionally bring about a world of various forms that are ordered towards particular ends. And among those various forms, there could be a form of rational social beings like us. So I think that there's both sort of more direct and indirect ways of getting to God. But if you're trying to posit a sort of Platonic alternative, first off, that's great, because that's definitely not physicalist, right? So we're already beyond physicalism and naturalism at that point. But then I would say I have issues with that because it's not going to satisfy the causal principle that we're committed to. And the only thing that's going to satisfy that causal principle is a concrete, purely actual, inherently conceptual prime thinker.
Well, gosh, there seems to be no escape from this argument.
Well, by the way, this is kind of traditional too. Is like, I mean, that's kind of Augustine's move, right? Is like, Plato isn't totally crazy, right? Or the Platonists aren't totally crazy to think that there's this sort of realm of the forms. They just need to understand that what they think is that the Platonic heaven just is the mind of God, right? And that's good, because now we have a concrete explanatory reality, and it's much simpler because now we have one reality, right? A purely actual being, right? who just is the fullness of existence itself. So it has explanatory simplicity there, and it has causal efficacy. So we take insights from Plato, like, okay, Plato wasn't completely off, but we just kind of take the realm of the forms, if you will, and just say, yeah, that's just the mind of God, right?
Yeah. Man, Pat, well, this has been fascinating. I really appreciate that, and I think it's so cool that you spend so much time just diving into these thought experiments, you could say, or
obscure topics that nobody else cares about.
Yeah. But it's so awesome and so needed. I think that's so cool to even point out in the human person, like, hey, you do realize like there is an invisible dimension to you. Like you have thoughts, you have these concepts. Well, those aren't things that you can test under a microscope. Those are actually invisible realities. Okay. And then once you can admit that there is an invisible dimension, that there's something beyond this physical world, then I think that does open all sorts of gateways to like, okay, then maybe there isn't a prime thinker. Maybe there's this invisible being that is being itself, that caused all things, that is this concrete thinker, like what you were saying.
And I'll just say a few more things, and talk about like invisible realities. I know people will sometimes maybe be uncomfortable with that term, but there's obviously aspects of reality that are not things that we can confirm through any sort of empirical or scientific test. And they're aspects of reality that science must itself assume to have any significance in the world. I mean, one is just diachronic identity, that there's a sort of sameness through difference. And I would argue that that's tied to essences. Now, there's no scientific test that we could give.
What do you mean by sameness with differences?
Right, that substances really endure over time despite their sort of contingent modifications over time.
Okay.
Right? What sort of scientific tests can we get for that? There really isn't anything, right? So we assume that that the thing at time A under the test is the same thing at time B in these tests. But that is precisely an assumption, right? It's not something in the vast majority of cases that we're ever going to be able to have an empirical test for. But it's one of those things that needs to be assumed in order to not just make science significant, but to make sense of science itself. So there's just the point I'm making is a general one, right? That here's presumably something that's an invisible reality, say in essence or substantial form, that science itself can't confirm but needs to assume. So if the objection is that if we can't test for it scientifically or empirically, it must not exist, I just think it's an absolutely false one. And to even hold that assumption is going to wreck science right from the start.
Wow. That's so powerful. It's like, okay, your assumptions though are invisible in nature. Not all of them, but some of them.
Many of
and
them.
The very process of thinking through things and these concepts and using math, let's say, like math itself is a conceptual science.
Right.
Yeah. So where does that come from?
And math is interesting because it's one of the things that like we know in one sense the most about, and it's in another sense the thing that we know the least about, right? So what do I mean by that? And math is something that like if you go to a math conference, unlike a philosophy conference, is like people don't really argue, right? It's like, oh yeah, you proved that. That's right. Like we feel like a lot of what goes on in math actually gives us a certainty of the conclusions, right? Like people don't argue about 2 + 2 = 4 unless they're like crazy off the deep end of postmodernism, right? There's just great certainty in mathematics. But then if you ask, what is mathematics about? What is math? Well, then that's when people start to argue, right? It's like this thing, it's very interesting is that there's like something we know the most about, but also the least about in a sense. And that's very fascinating, isn't it? Now that's a whole different conversation. But I think, again, theism offers some really great explanatory resources in terms of the philosophy of mathematics, but we can save that for another time.
Yes. Well, Pat, any final comments for our dear listeners on this wonderful day?
No, I would just say that if you like the sketch I gave, and it is a horribly inadequate sketch, I'm building from a number of different thinkers in the paper that I'm working from. So one of them, of course, is John Haldane, who I mentioned. So you can check out John Haldane in his book, Atheism and Theism. It's kind of a dialogue exchange book with a naturalist named Jack Smart. And he kind of first presents it there. So if people want to check that out, they can. It's a great book in general. I highly recommend it. And then I'm also borrowing the argument against formal thinking being reducible to any physical process or event. I'm borrowing from a thinker named James Ross there. And he develops that argument a bit more in detail in his book, Thought and World. So if you want to just kind of see the seeds of the different places I'm gathering my own thought for my own paper, I would just check out those resources.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Pat, and thanks for sharing your brilliant mind with us today. My gosh, it's just amazing to me. And and everyone out there listening, please like and subscribe to our podcast, our YouTube channels, and that would really help us out. And God bless.
God bless. Thank you.
The mission of Holy Apostles College and Seminary is to form faithful witnesses of Christ. Year after year, the prestigious Newman Guide has recommended Holy Apostles for our academic excellence and steadfast fidelity to the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church. We are also fully accredited and the leader in Catholic online learning. Our students enjoy the unsurpassed flexibility to study on their own time and anywhere in the world through asynchronous engagement. Holy Apostles is dedicated to the relentless pursuit of truth, which allows students in all academic programs, including undergraduate, graduate, and personal interest, to formulate a coherent worldview based on both faith and reason. The study of the liberal arts also develops and refines key competencies associated with career readiness, such as critical thinking and problem solving, clear communication, collaboration, and a strong work ethic. The tuition rate at Holy Apostles is one of the most affordable in the country. Yearly tuition for a full-time undergraduate is under $12,000. Students at Holy Apostles can graduate with minimal or even no college debt, which enables them to live out their calling as faithful witnesses of Christ without heavy financial burdens holding them back. Please visit www.holyapostles.edu/admissions for more information. The Fall 2021 admissions deadline is Friday, July 23rd. Classes start Monday, August 30th. See you soon.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.